Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I am Kate Faulkner, Director of Public Programs at the Norton Museum of Art. Welcome to this evening's virtual conversation, For the Record, Ann Weaver Norton. Tonight, Rachel Gustafson, Assistant Curator and Curator of the exhibition For the Record, Celebrating Art by Women, discusses the work of sculptor and educator Ann Weaver Norton with Margaret Horgan, Managing Director of the Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens. Before her current role as Managing Director, Margaret was Director of Community Engagement for 8 years. The current exhibition, For the Record, Celebrating Art by Women, showcases a breadth of work created by women from the Nortons collection, including Ann Weaver Norton's work, Variation. Tonight's conversation will touch on Ann's legacy as an artist and the foundation she established to preserve the grounds, art, and architecture that comprises ANSG. Please note that during tonight's program, you are encouraged to post questions and comments through the chat features on YouTube and Facebook, and we will dedicate the final few minutes of the program to answering your questions. And now I'd like to welcome Rachel Gustafson and Margaret Horgan to the program.
Hey, Kate, thanks for that introduction. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hello, Margaret. How are you this evening?
I'm great. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Yeah, it's just excellent to have these two, in a way, sister museums collaborating together on a program like this for an exhibition like this. And we were able to come to your facility and produce a short video to give people insight into what they could experience if they came to visit the Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens. So if you don't mind, we're going to roll that video so everyone at home could take a look.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Great. And there she was there at the end. We got to see Ann Weaver Norton hanging above their fireplace. And I should also mention that the Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens is housed in the original home that Ralph and Elizabeth Norton lived in, and then later Ralph and Ann. So just something to share. And if we can start the PowerPoint, we'll be able to show some images actually of this work on view, Variation by Ann Weaver Norton. And it's actually one of the first works you'll encounter when you enter this exhibition. I should just point out for viewers at home that For the Record, Celebrating Art by Women was an exhibition that was really born out of the 100-year anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which, as many of you know, allowed some women access to the vote and the democratic process, but certainly not all of them. And in all, there's 59 objects by 54 different artists, and it spans 140 years of artistic expression. So it is a beauty, and definitely one I hope you come to see if you feel comfortable. And while you're here, maybe you'll stop at the Ann Norton Sculpture Garden at some point once they reopen later this fall. So we will be going through just a list of slides here that understand exactly a little bit about Ann Weaver Norton as an artist, this particular work, and as well as some other works that relate and were actually gifted to the museum by Ann Weaver Norton. And so the first thing we'll do here is one more slide, please. Just look a little bit closer at this sculpture before we go into a video that'll show you a 360-degree quick view or tour around the sculpture. So if we can play that, please. And so this will just give folks at home a real understanding for the surface quality of this piece. Is there anything that viewers should be looking at home, Margaret?
I just look at this piece and I'm in awe. I just think it's so beautiful. It's my first time seeing it. I haven't had an opportunity to see it in person yet.
And it's very modernist, isn't it? I mean, it is. When I think of her earlier work, or even some of the larger sculptural pieces that are on your property, this is just a standout to me. But we saw in that video that modernist bust was really something that preoccupied Ann Weaver Norton much throughout her life. All right, so here we'll go into some more images that show a bit more of this first gallery in the exhibition. Now, for those of you who might be coming to see the show, this is really what kicks off chronologically the exhibition. We have really early works in this space from even 1881 all the way through 1960. And you see Ann Weaver Norton's variations there on the foreground on the left. But then beyond it, if we can go to the next slide, what you'll see even more focus is Blackwear ceramics by Maria and Santana Martinez. They are ceramicists out of New Mexico. And what's interesting is that Ann Weaver Norton later in her life gifted those objects. It was actually a complete set of 11 ceramics to the museum. So later on in the presentation, we'll look a little bit about that legacy. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of a young Ann Von Weaver before she becomes Ann Weaver Norton. So Margaret, can you tell us a little bit about the early days?
Sure. So Ann originally went off to college at Smith College for religious studies. And she did very well when she was there. But I think she very quickly realized that what was in her heart is that she wanted to be an artist. And so upon graduating, she went straight to New York, where she started to study art. And there is a great picture of her. She looks so young in this image, but I just love it. And that was her goal, was to become an artist. And that's what she did.
And at some point, she does leave New York and comes to Florida. So could you tell us a little bit about why she chose Florida? What called her here?
Well, I think the reality is, when Ann was really making her way in New York, she was a female and she was a sculptor, which was kind of a tough combination. And it was in the Depression. So I think that even though Ann did have some incredible acknowledgement, she showed, at the Whitney, at the MoMA, she had some great recognition in publications and a few sales, but not enough to sustain her to be able to actually live as an artist. And I think when this opportunity arose, a friend of hers found that advertisement and suggested to her that she try it. And she had an incredible education, but she'd never actually been an educator. And I think she saw this as her chance where she could finally go somewhere and make a living, teach art, while simultaneously being able to continue to create her own artworks.
Right, because the job posting was actually before the Norton Museum of Art was the Norton Museum of Art. It was actually the Norton Gallery and School. And so that job posting would have been to come down here and to be an instructor. And is it true that she was the first female sculpture teacher at the school?
Yes, she was the first sculpting instructor at the school, and she was a female.
Ever. So she was first in two ways then.
Exactly.
Okay. And then if we go on, there's another image here that shows Ann Weaver Norton with Ralph Norton on the right, and then another instructor, de Kreft, and his wife as well. So maybe could you just give a little background as to how they came to be married?
Yes. Yes. First thing that I want to say too is that de Kreft he actually came and became a sculptor. He replaced Ann as the sculpting instructor when Ann and Ralph were married. They were great friends, and he came in and filled that slot. So we're very fortunate here at the Gardens because Ann saved so much of her letters, of her correspondence, and we have great letters between Ann and Ralph and Elizabeth of a great friendship. And really, I think it was a common interest, obviously, between Ann and Ralph. He would sit in on her sculpting classes. He was very intrigued by her direct carving techniques. And he really loved her independence, and he loved her very strong opinions about artwork and other artists. And so much of the correspondence between them, and I'm sure it was the same in real life, was comparing how they interpreted artists, if they shared the same opinions. A lot of it was they weren't always on the same page.
So there's some creative arguments, maybe.
Exactly. There were absolutely some creative arguments. So I think art was truly the foundation of their relationship. They had a great friendship and really respected each other's opinions.
And later on, Ralph Norton actually built the studio that you're sitting in right now. That was her working studio every day, wasn't?
That's correct. It was his wedding gift for her in 1948. He had Marion Sims Wyeth design this for her so that she could keep going. And I also want to mention too that one other thing that Ralph really loved about Ann was he actually bought a few of her works, which was able to support her to keep going. This is before just when she was the teacher. And he loved that all of the money that she made went right back into her artwork. It was for her to buy more supplies, to have things done in the foundry. So.
And that's an interesting point, because most of the art, with the exception of variation actually, but most of the art in our collection by Ann Weaver Norton was bequested to the museum by Ralph Norton. So would have been.
He was her biggest fan.
Right. And then on the next image, we actually get to see Ann at work. So here you see her carving 7 beings, which was one of the very totemic and large site-specific sculpture installations that we saw in the video. We'll see another picture of it in just a second. But I was hoping you could fill in people on perhaps a little bit about her process, and specifically the influence of Bryce Canyon in Utah, because I know that was a big influence for her on this particular work.
Yes, Ann really fell in love with the Arizona, Utah, New Mexico landscape. She has said that from a very young age, she loved mountains, she loved wide open spaces, and she loved that she felt she could actually see hidden images in the mountains, that she could see people or different forms in that and in them. And she found that very inspiring, and she carried that with her when she came back and when she moved forward with her other artwork. She also loved the color of the mountains and the soil there too. That was very much an inspiration for her.
And the direct carving method is pretty physical. And she was a rather petite woman. And I see her up here on scaffolding in a minute. I think folks will be able to see just how large these works are. But was there ever anything that she recollected or talked about enjoying the physicality of the medium she chose, or what brought her to
I just don't think it, I don't think it ever deterred her. I don't think it ever occurred to her. I think she had specific vision and very big dreams, and I don't think that she saw that as a boundary. Beautiful. And on the next slide, we'll actually see a picture of Bryce Canyon. Oh, maybe it's on the next one then. Let's see, let's go one more. There you are. So on that former slide, what you actually saw was 7 figures in totality. So let's actually go back one slide for just a moment. So there you'll see it's really a grouping of very large sculptures. How tall is the highest one, Margaret, do you know? 21 feet, I believe. Wow, wow. And how many years, how long was the process when she was working on that? That took her, well, when Ralph was still alive, she already had begun this vision for this piece. And it was originally just 3 beings. And after traveling more and learning about different materials, it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And, you know, she was very adamant about saying they're not neither human nor animal. They're just beings. And, you know, they've really become the sentinels in the gardens. We love them. And then when we look at the Bryce Canyon picture, I think I immediately see these relationships between almost like a totemic rock formation. And I can totally see the connection as to why this space would have influenced her direction with this project she was working on. And on the next slide, this is a work in the Norton's collection called Draped Figure. And I do see a relationship between what she did in 7 Beings and this particular work. So what do you see here, Margaret? I do too. I especially with the facial features. I see that, and sort of, you know, all around. Yes, I 100% can see that. And this is actually on view in our permanent galleries in the American collection. So if you were to come to see the museum tomorrow, you'd be able to see this work as well.
And on the next slide, there's another image here that shows Ann working in wood. So she's obviously working with the diverse sculptural media. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that as well.
I think Anne continually drew inspiration from her travels, and she spent a little bit of time in the Pacific Northwest, where she really fell in love with cedar and the trees and all of the totems that she saw there. Mm-hmm. So in the late 50s, she began getting wood shipped here for her to carve. Mm-hmm. And she started doing that here in her studio in the early 60s.
Right, and we saw some of those big pieces of wood in the video earlier.
Mm-hmm. Her gateways.
The gateways. And let's move on, and because there's something that I find really interesting when you consider variation within the larger body of work that became her oeuvre, particularly the shift that I think occurred in the 1940s and 50s, and then into the 60s, like you said, when she kind of gained more confidence, perhaps. And so on the next slide, we'll see two works that are also in the Norton's collection that are earlier, 1940s, 1943, and definitely representational, perhaps a little abstracted, but we can clearly see figures here. And then on the next slide, we kind of see these three in tandem. And so what do you see as happening here?
Well, I definitely see them as being indicative of the times. I mean, the Depression had ended, and now was down here, had a little bit more time to create, a little bit more financial freedom. And I think she always had the desire in her heart, had more of a passion for abstract work. And mm-hmm. I think as she grew older and had more experience, I think that's probably when she felt the most comfortable expressing it.
And on the next slide, I think we're able to see that like variation is not a singular thing. In fact, this motif on the next slide we'll see is something that she pursued thoroughly. So on the mm-hmm. left, we have one sketch or drawing that she would have done of a very similar composition to what we see in variation. And then on the right, another sketch with another torso on top of it. And then on the next slide, we see another one here, a combination where perhaps the variation gets a little bit more surface texture. Things actually slim out a little bit. It feels a little bit more Giacometti-like to me than what we have on view in For the Record. And so I'm wondering, was this something she was obsessed with? Do you see a lot of other objects like this?
I would say it's interesting that you say that too, because it was.
Oh, it looks like we lost Margaret. Let's hope that she comes back here in just a moment. But if not, just to continue this idea, there's this real notion here of a continued theme in her work, and it's one that we see in variation that's on view in the Norton, but then also, as I mentioned, something that's definitely on view in her studio if you were to visit the Sculpture Garden.
I'm back.
Here she is.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. It just went dark. But what I was going to say is that we're very lucky in that we do have all these sketches, and this all started around that same time in the 60s, mm-hmm. that we had a lot more of her pastels and watercolors, and that we have the different stages of her drawings. But certainly the torso figure was something that she definitely had in her mind a lot of creative energy for.
That's excellent to see. I was actually blown away the first time I came to visit you all and see that variation was not a standalone. I don't know why I would have thought in my head that this was a one thing, but obviously upon coming to visit you all, I could tell it was something that she really focused on quite a lot.
And I also think she enjoyed working in different materials. I think mm-hmm. I get the sense that she wanted to try it in several different mediums.
Oh, well, that's an excellent segue to the next slide, actually, because we did find that in a few different instances, our records here at the Norton weren't as robust as we would have liked them to be. So a lot of research and collaboration happened between the Norton Museum of Art and the Ann Norton Sculpture Garden to kind of pinpoint an exact date for the work that's on view and For the Record, but also its exhibition history. So what we see on the screen here is a brochure of this body of work, of these torsos of the variation that would have happened here at the Norton. And I'm not exactly sure what year it occurred. Were we ever able to locate the year this exhibition happened?
No.
Yeah, it must have been in the 60s. There was something that I read
was.
in it. It was like, it said either 1950. I can't really quite remember, but it's interesting to be able to have our records reflect one thing and your records have some information that we need. And together we're able to complete that.
I think the whole body of it, though, it would have had to have been, in order to create an exhibition, it would have had to have been in the 60s.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And actually, one more slide here, we're able to see even more this idea that Margaret brought up about taking this composition, taking this idea and applying it in different materials. So here she's actually taking on a very similar composition, almost exactly to what we see in Variation, into marble. And this dates to 1968. So with that knowledge, we're able to a little bit more accurately date the work in our collection, which we're really, really thankful for. And on the next slide, we're going to bring it back around. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this exhibition really does try to find connections that are not only temporal, but also stylistic. And so you'll see at the center of your screen, these 3 ceramic pieces, again, by Maria and Santana Martinez, and they're flanked on the left by Kathy Kolwitz, etching, and on the right, an Agnes Martin early kind of geometric abstraction before she really launches into what we know her work as in terms of simplistic geometric forms. But these 4 together, I just love this viewpoint. I love the way that all these works talk together. But for me, for those of you who watch Norton from home often, you probably know I like to dig deep into the nerdy details. And for me, one of the biggest things that stuck out was this relationship between the Blackwear ceramics and Ann Weaver Norton as the donor of these works. So the only reason these works are in our collection is because Ann Weaver Norton decided to gift them to the museum. And so just a little bit of background on these works. Maria Martinez, along with her husband Julian, were working in an ancient process for producing all black pottery. Today it's probably known as best as Blackware. And these vessels were unique to the San Ildefonso Pueblo, which was in New Mexico and was established as far back as 1300, where Maria Martinez had lived all of her life. And this ancient form of pottery had been lost. But in 1909, the couple, Maria and Julian, were able to revive a procedure for smudging clay and collaboratively developed this San Ildefonso Blackware, as it was known. And it really was an international, dare I say, commodity. It was something that people really sought in the 1920s and beyond. And in the early days of the marriage, Julian actually worked with Maria to paint the black detail on the sculpture. And we'll actually be able to see in a moment some details of that. But I find that part of collaboration between the family really interesting. And when Julian died, her daughter-in-law, Santana, started painting the design. So that's why these ceramics are attributed to both Maria and Santana. And I was wondering, I know, Margaret, that there's a lot, as you mentioned, interest in Ann Weaver Norton's life in the American Southwest. And I'd like to bring up the note that you were able to find here, if you wouldn't mind just reading it for us and giving us a little bit of background.
Sure. It says, for many years, I have been inspired by the rock foundations in our own Southwest and by the Navajo and Hopi Indians who live near them. So we're lucky and kept really detailed notes in her later years. And this particular note was about a piece that she created that's in Brattle Square called Gateway to Knowledge in Cambridge. And even then, that was later towards the end of Ann's life when this piece came to life. She was still reflecting on the inspiration of her travels to that part of the country, which had originally started, the first time she went was in 1954 with her mother.
Wonderful. And did that happen right after Ralph's passing?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that it was probably a trip filled with still quite a bit of sadness. Mm-hmm. But I am under the impression that is when that would have been the trip when she acquired these pieces.
And on the next slide, we'll actually be able to look at these pieces in a little bit more detail. So now you're able to see that there is this black on black idea, right? You have a very shiny and matte surface. The matte part would have been the painted designs done by Santana, and the sculpting and the making of the clay would have been Maria's efforts, just to give the viewers at home a little bit of better look of these works. And as my nerdy ventures continue, I looked at the archive to see if there was any material surrounding this donation. And on the next slide, we'll actually see a letter that Ann Weaver Norton sent to the director of the Norton Museum at the time, E.R. Hunter, kind of explaining her gift. And you'll see that there's these sketches on the left and the right. I think I found out perhaps what those sketches relate to, but there was this other blank piece of paper in our files as well. And on the next slide, if you turn it over, we have what looks, it's kind of hard to see, but what looks to be almost like a layout of these objects, how they would have been displayed. I know that Margaret and I talked about this earlier, and we don't believe it's something that Ann Weaver Norton would have produced, but it could have been something that they discussed, E.R. Hunter and Ann together, about how these works would be displayed. And I think that's quite fascinating. And then on the next slide, you'll see actually there's these two photos that were sent along with this letter. At the time, Ann Weaver was really interested in actually understanding the value of these ceramic pieces when they were given to the museum. And so they went through a bit of a fact-finding mission to try to locate more information about what the value of those pieces would have been at the time of their gifting. And so the pictures that you see on the right-hand side actually correlate to the diagram. And so there's a numbered process to let the valuation process be better understood. And on the next slide, we're able to see a letter, and this letter is quite interesting to me. It is from E.R. Hunter to the Museum of New Mexico, and it explains a little bit about kind of the interest that this museum has in learning more from Marjorie Lambert, who was their curator of research. And so the Norton director writes to the Museum of New Mexico director, Mrs. Norton bought the ceramics from the artist herself in the spring of 1954 and conceived the idea of them to give them to us a year or so ago when Jimmy Ernst was the Norton's guest instructor. At that time, one of our trustees gave the museum one of Ernst's black-on-black paintings, and we subsequently installed Mrs. Norton's group of Maria's pottery alongside to everyone's pleasure. And he closes saying, I tell you this because we are not otherwise in this collecting field. So ceramics would have not been something, or at least Southwestern ceramics would not have been something the museum would have collected otherwise. But what I think is really interesting is on the next slide, what we get to see is this Jimmy Ernst painting. He was the son of surrealist painter Max Ernst and the historian and journalist Louis Strauss. And on the next slide, we'll be able to see that painting with these ceramics together. And so now that you see this, Margaret, what do you think she was thinking? What was the mindset? I see correlation, so I'm just curious what your read is on it.
I don't know, but it just makes me so happy. I just love that. I don't know.
Well, obviously she's seeing a visual cue from one to the other, and I just find it fascinating. I know you had mentioned earlier that in the early days, Ann and Ralph would travel to look at possible acquisitions for the museum together.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we spoke earlier, what I like to believe is in the early days of Ann and Ralph's friendship, they went on these scouting missions together. They would meet in New York along with other fellows. And I would like to think that was Ann's intention when she purchased these pieces, was that they would someday find their way in the Norton Museum. And obviously it was not just a one-time thought for her, that she went through this specific process and this particular painting. And I think it's incredible. And I love that she was supporting another female artist.
And in so many ways, it's very forward thinking, because this idea of pairing a very modern contemporary painting with ceramics, almost an artisan craft, if you will, is something that is really becoming more regular in museums today. But at the time, it wouldn't have been something necessarily that everyone did. So I'm quite impressed and happy to find that little detail in our records. And then in the next letter, and there's not much more in terms of the history around this, but I just wanted to point out that what ended up happening to fulfill the valuation element was the museum writes back to E.R. Hunter. They say, really the best person to survey these works are Martinez's son, Popovada. And they call out specifically at the end, Mrs. Lampert, again, the curator of research for that museum, says, I might add that the photographs indicate that Mrs. Norton made a very fine selection. So I love to see that as well. And then we're going to close with this interesting article that came out in the New York Times. I love that headline. I know it's not too long from that article being written to her passing, I believe, but could you explain a little bit about the notoriety that Anne was gaining only later in her life, Margaret?
Yes, I think really when we first talked about this, I don't know if it was the notoriety that was the most important thing to Anne, or if it was just her desire to share her work
broadly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that truly, and as when she became ill and towards the end of her life, her singular mission was to create this space that is now here in the community. And she wanted people to, we have quotes from her. She wanted to create things for people to be uplifted by. And she wanted the public to be able to come and learn about art, see her art, see other artists come through here. And, you've heard it said before, the Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens is very much her monument valley. And she really, towards the end, all she cared about was creating the space that was going to outlive her and be here for generations to come.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing all that, Margaret. And we'll just close with one more final slide that shows, again, this work on view so centrally located within the opening gallery of the exhibition. And I think what we'll do now is probably take a little bit of questions. I do see some in the queue. I see one that's for me and one that is definitely for you, Margaret. So Greg, if we can take the PowerPoint down, there we are. I'll start with the question for you, Margaret. We have a particular viewer asking to learn more about the Brickwork sculptures. She says they are amazing and mysterious, and she wants to know a little bit more, if you could explain.
Okay. Well, the brick was very intentional, and felt that brick was perfect to be outside because brick is from the earth, and brick goes so naturally out in nature and amongst the trees that it seemed like just a very organic, natural element, not to mention the fact that they are very hardy and can withstand time, just like the trees in this garden have. And she was very particular about the different bricks for each piece too. She had them all created for each one and was very specific about the color choice.
And she grew up in Selma, Alabama, and I do remember seeing in her book that weren't there brick chimneys that kind of caught her attention at a young age?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. I think it all harkens back to her roots for sure.
And it's interesting too, when you said the thing about bricks and they come from the earth, I do have to wonder, ceramics are made of clay. Clay comes from the earth. I see other correlations there too. And then the other question we have this evening asked specifically about the markings on the Blackwear ceramics, if there were details, and indeed there are. If you do feel comfortable coming to the museum, the black on black quality of the works does make it hard to see in reproductions, but there are borders, decorative borders all around each of the three ceramics. So they indeed have markings. And much like the Jimmy Ernst black on black paintings, we have black and black ceramics. So I really do see what her mindset was when she decided to gift those works to the museum after a long loan to show them alongside Ernst's painting. So I do see, let's see, one more, just a comment. It looks like someone saying that they've visited several sculpture gardens and to the Ann Norton Sculpture Garden, I'm assuming, and it was amazing, a true treasure. And I couldn't agree with them more. It took me quite a long time to get over there, and I'm very happy that I did and to be exposed to this fascinating artist. So thank you again, Margaret, for letting us have a peek inside.
Well, I can't thank you enough for inviting me and for this whole program, because as I told you before, we didn't know about those pieces that we had no record of that here, no correspondence. So it was such a treasure for us to learn about that. And thank you for reaching out and sharing that with us and sharing that with everyone else too.
Likewise, more great partnership opportunities to come, I'm sure.
Good. Good. I hope so.
Yes.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Right.
Well, thank you again. And I think Kate will join us for a quick exit goodbye, and then we'll move right along. So thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Rachel and Margaret, for joining us virtually tonight and sharing your insights and knowledge about Ann's life and work. And a special thanks to all of our viewers for tuning in to this program tonight. On Thursday, August 26th, please make sure and come back and visit. Rachel Gustafsson will be giving a virtual talk, Her Story of the Norton, where she will discuss artworks included in the fabulous exhibition For the Record, Celebrating Art by Women. Until then, thank you and have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.